Welcome to Florida. Welcome to South Florida in particular. It's good to see all of you here. One thing Jeffrey did not say is that I also worked at the University of Georgia as a Dean of Agriculture there, so I've worked with Cecilia in the past and Jeffrey now. And I've traveled around the world quite a bit and seen much of what you do, and in fact I've worked in many of your institutions over the past couple decades. I was asked to speak generally about agriculture and the importance of it. I want to try to work in some of the themes of your presentation. I hope you don't mind. This is scheduled for 45 minutes, and I probably will use up a fair amount of that because there is food and there's stuff to drink after me, I assume. But anyway, again, we want to welcome you here. This is, it's been a tough time for this area. From here all the way up to Fort Myers, as you know, Hurricane Ian. Well, it turned out to be a pretty small hurricane, at least in the areas that it impacted. If you were impacted by it, you were just devastated. There are places in Florida now that still don't look like anything it did before the hurricane went through, and it was just everything is gone in some areas. And so while the hurricane then moved inland, certainly for IFAS, we had one of our facilities in Ona that had a fair amount of damage. It looks like about $1.5 million worth of damage there. Everywhere else seems to have been relatively well spared from the hurricane, unless you were directly in that path, and if you were, then everything is not going well right now. So thank you for being here. This is an area that's trying to get back on its feet as quickly as possible, so we appreciate your willingness to still come, despite the damage that had been done. Open up your pocketbooks and your wallets and spend some money while you're here. Help get this economy going and make sure you're enjoying some of the good food of this area. And I'm glad to see that you're going to have a tour of several areas where these plants are grown as well, because this is a fascinating part of the state. We were talking just a few minutes ago where Jeffrey works. These are, Gilly, what do you call the soils of that area? They're basically coral rocks. Okay, but they're only about that deep, and it's basically hydroponic culture. But then you can go 10 or 20 miles from that, and you're into the muck soils, which would be south of Lake Okeechobee, 75% organic matter, and which are 100% different from some of these calcareous soils that you would see down in the Homestead area. So, and pretty much everything in between. You're right on the border of tropical versus subtropical production right now. And it's just an incredibly diverse area, whether it's in people or soils. The climate can change very quickly from one location to another. It's a fascinating area to try to grow more food in. I thought I was going to talk mostly about the need to produce more food. I think most of you understand that we got to grow more food on this planet. I'm going to round back to technology and why that's the solution. But mostly I wanted to talk about the future of what you will be doing in your industries, where the funding comes from, and it doesn't necessarily have to be from the United States, because there's a general wave around the world right now with the understanding that we got to produce more food, and that we have no more land, and we have no more water, and the only way that can happen is with technology. And that's what all of you do. All of you develop technologies to make sure we can essentially double food production on the same amount of land. So you've heard this before. We've 70%, 100% more food by the year 2050 without more resources. And frankly, with fewer resources, because we are in Brazil right now, we're taking land out of production and putting it back into tropical rainforests for carbon sequestration. And in Europe, there are areas where yields are actually going down because of a conversion from more traditional agriculture to other forms of agriculture. And with climate change around much of the world as well, particularly in China and India, where they're just being hit hard by climate change, everything is different right now. But it's becoming harder and harder to produce more food. So you got double food production on the same amount of land, less water, probably fewer fertilizers, fewer inputs. And that's where you all come in. And so whether it's genetics or cultural practices or new and better types of fertilizers. These are the only ways that we're going to be able to do this. So that's kind of the paradigm of what we're working under. But here in the United States, not necessarily a few other places, China, Brazil are increasing funding for research. But our funding for research in the United States has been relatively static, and it has just barely kept up with inflation over about the last 20 years. So this is it's not a political statement. Under Trump, the research funding grew by about a couple percent. Under President Biden, it has grown by about the same amount. Under President Obama, it grew by about the same amount. So all of our, for those in the U.S. who rely on NIFA funding, the agency that I used to manage, there's simply not enough money to support the research that has to be done. And so I have a kind of rounding back to a request here. As I said, it's basically kept up with inflation. Now under Trump, the new funding was focused more on things like high technology. Under President Biden, it's focused more on climate change and sustainability. But in some ways, it's all kind of the same thing. And in some ways, it's all been the same thing because it just creeps up a little bit, essentially with inflation every year. So how are we going to feed so many people with not enough resources? There are a lot of ways of looking at this. Certainly, we, and now I'm including those of you from other countries, we're in this with industry too. So I'm seeing some sponsors around here. Industry is joined at the hip with whether it's a federal agency like the USDA, Agricultural Research Service, the state government, which would primarily be through the land-grant university, or industry. There's no way we can work independently. We all have a very separate role, but the roles contribute to the increase in food production that we all have as our mandate and essentially as our obligation as well. So there are different types of research, obviously. You've got very applied research. So that applied type research often can be conducted by a land-grant university, mostly through extension, very applied research, extension type research. It can be done by industry as they develop new chemicals and get them tested out in the field. And it can be then done to a lesser extent by the land-grant universities. Now, in land-grant universities, we get funding from basically two different sources. Some of it comes from the state government. So the University of Georgia, the University of Florida are two of the best funded state land grants in the country. They tend to be traditional, more agrarian-based, more focused on agriculture. So we're pretty well supported by the states of Florida and Georgia. That's not true for all other states. In fact, some other states are actually losing money right now. And one of the reasons for that, by the way, is which I do want to relate as what I think is a problem. I'm not going to mention any of the states, but there are several right now that are losing land-grant funding literally as we speak. And I think part of what has happened there is that they have focused so much on long-term, basic, high-level, some may even call it ivory tower type research, that the farmers in that state have lost track of what that land grant is doing. What are they working on, and that benefits me today, that keeps me employed tomorrow, that allows my business to flourish. So they're working on things that are incredibly important 20, 30, 40 years from now, that basic research. We all know we need it. Someone's got to do it. Yet, because they've abandoned some of the short-term research, I've worked a lot on plant nutrients, and I always use the example as phosphorus fertilizer application to peanuts. No one is going to win a Nobel Prize working on peanuts and phosphorus fertilizers. Yet for a peanut farmer in South Georgia, for example, that's the most important question that they have. They absolutely need better information on that to manage the high cost of fertilizers. Fertilizer costs, as you know, have doubled or tripled in the last about 18 months or so, and farmers are looking for ways to cut back on its utilization. And so Those farmers are not with peanuts, but those farmers that are no longer getting the immediate needs solved through their land-grant universities, they then stop going to the state capitol, they then stop advocating for your budgets, and that's when this whole thing starts to spiral down. So a lot of you in here actually work on pretty applied things that the producers in your state care about. But make sure that the farmers, the agribusinesses, the politicians that represent areas that represent rural areas of the state, for example, make sure they know what you're doing. Because if they don't, then they lose that connection to you. They lose the interest in going to the state capitol during the session and voting for your budgets. And you can make almost a direct correlation between the focus that land-grant school has had on applied research, adaptive research, and budgets. So again, that's not to say that basic research is not important, both in the short term and in the long term, but that then it becomes more of a federal government. In my opinion, that becomes more of a federal government initiative or some of the basic R&D of industries that we work with. The NIFA, for example, the agency that I ran for a couple years, they are pretty well split between, well, it's not so true. They're more focused on the basic side, but they do have applied components to it. So the specialty crop research, which probably some of you in here are part of, and citrus greening research, which in Florida that we are so concerned about. And by the way, we've lost about 2/3 of our citrus production in Florida to HLB, citrus greening. You'll probably get to see some of that over the next couple days. So there's a component to NIFA research that is applied and adaptive, but most of it is still basic. So the system that is starting to develop, and at least at the US level, is that the states will handle the applied, the adaptive research, and the federal government then, certainly NIFA, and then even more than that, groups like the National Science Foundation will cover and support the basic long-term research. For a university, I can tell you from personal experience, I've worked at the University of Maryland, University of Georgia, and now University of Florida. The president of every university wanted to know why we did not have enough Nobel laureates, AAAS members, National Academy members on our staff. That's what they are measured by. They are impacted by ratings. I can tell you, everyone in here that works at a land-grant university, the thing your president thinks about the most is where you are ranked and what can they do to get the rankings higher than where they are today. University of Florida right now is ranked number 5 for land-grant universities. And all our president wants is for us to go up to number 4 or number 3. It doesn't matter that we have gotten to number 5. And by the way, we are getting a new president here at the University of Florida in just the next couple of months, and he has already talked about the need to move up in the rankings. And I just, when you move up from number 5 to number 4, you're bumping out a pretty good school at that point. And so I don't know how that's going to happen, but that will always be how presidents are how they evaluate your programs, is by rankings. On the other hand, people like me and Dean Place at Georgia and all the other schools the pressure that we face is from the farmers and the producers and the agribusinesses and the homeowners for landscaping and from youth groups for 4-H. What our constituents want is making today better, making tomorrow better. They're not so worried about research that will impact your industry 30 or 40 years from now. So that's kind of the system. You need to be doing both is the issue. You can't ignore one. If you ignore the applied adaptive research, then the farmers and the legislators get mad and they cut your budget. If you don't do any of the long-term basic research, then your president gets mad and I get fired if that's the road we're going down. So that's the conundrum that I, as a university agricultural leader, but all of your bosses too, if you're at a university. And much of that is true as well if you're at a university in anywhere else in the country or around the world. The same pressure of basic versus applied, that is in all of us right now. And it doesn't mean that, as I look at any of you in here, it doesn't mean you have to do both. You can focus your career on basic research, but you better have someone in the university who's also working on short-term research in the same area, so they can take the fundamental knowledge that you're developing and move that into commercialization and into the private sector, so then it can be marketed more quickly. One of the things we do in research, whether it's this country or another one, it's that we de-risk what is needed at the farm level. We are very fortunate in universities because we have the opportunity to fail and we won't lose our job. If you work for Syngenta, for example, and you have 10 projects and 9 out of the 10 projects fail, you're going to get fired. And you're going to be fired long before you get to see number 9 fail. But if you're at a university and you have 9 out of 10 projects fail, as long as that one that works is a significant and important discovery, then you're just fine. So we have great opportunity to fail when those in industry don't, when those even in government have less of an opportunity to fail than we do in universities. So Bill Gates, I think whether or not this is true, he said this, someone told me it wasn't, but I had heard he said if you're not failing 75% of the time, then you're not taking enough risk. And so he actually purportedly punishes people for not failing enough. If everything you do goes well, then he thinks, well, you haven't taken enough risk. The risk is where those significant and important advancements come from. It's not from the easy stuff that we do every day. It's from taking chances. He said if you're not failing a lot, then you're not taking enough risk. And we can do that. We're so fortunate in universities to be able to take risks, to fail. But when it does work, that's when the improvement, that next big jump, comes from. So at the University of Florida right now, we're deeply involved in that next jump, which is artificial intelligence. And by the way, we hope that we have a number of faculty here today. We hope that you will speak with them. We are looking for partners. We have a large computer. It's called the Hypergator. Everything at the University of Florida, by the way, has Gator in the title, one way or another. So the Hypergator, it was a donation from NVIDIA, Chris Malachowski, who was one of the founders of NVIDIA. It's currently the fastest AI supercomputer in academia anywhere in the world. And then the state has made an investment of 100 new faculty, 15 in agriculture, although we did have some already in place. So we have one of the largest cohorts of AI scientists in agriculture, probably in the world right now. The interesting thing about what we're doing is that we're not really growing out artificial intelligence, finding how to improve artificial intelligence. Rather, what we are doing is finding ways to use that tool. AI is just a tool. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, decision-making, data management, those are all just tools. We are, at the University of Florida, we are taking AI to all different disciplines. So everywhere in agriculture, whether it's plant breeding or disease identification or irrigation scheduling, ecosystem services, that's all being built around artificial intelligence right now. Our expectation is that every student who graduates from the University of Florida will have some basic knowledge of artificial intelligence. But we are only using a fraction of the Hypergator computer, so we've got the people now. What we are looking for are partners to work with us. If you've got ideas that you think would be appropriate for machine learning, artificial intelligence, please talk to one of the faculty in here. We have lots and lots of opportunities to work with many of you in here. We, obviously, because of the investment we have made, we think it's an important part of the future, and we are well down this road right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think is going to be the future of how you get money for science, but particularly from the federal government. I've already talked about the differences between industry, which I would include commodity groups in there, so industries and the state government through the land grant system, but the federal agencies like the National Science Foundation, like NIFA. NIFA would probably be the most important one. And every one of you come from a country that has similar types of organizations, so my comments are fairly generic. And what I saw during my time at NIFA and where the funding cycles seem to be going, because they are changing. Some of them are very obvious, and I think you, just in your gut, you already know this. But let me go over a couple of the changes that are happening. So whether or not you're applying for funding from the National Science Foundation, NIFA, DFID in England, or Embrapa in Brazil, or any other funding agency around the world, the same type of thing as we used to get agricultural research leaders together around the world, they were all developing this similar type of umbrella. So here's some of the things that are happening. First of all, I think you all realize it has to be multidisciplinary. All the easy stuff has been done. There's no simple questions left. Everything that is left requires people from different disciplines, people from different perspectives. That's why international work is so important right now, that just assuming that the people at your university or your university in the ARS lab that is closest to you, there may be people in another country who have a vastly different approach to your problem in your state and your community with your commodity. So you need to be working with people who are from different locations, different disciplines, different perspectives on the world. That's one of the reasons why there are a lot of reasons why diversity is so important, but that's one of the main ones, is when you have people who look differently working together, you often bring in different perspectives. They have different experiences, different lives lived, and so they can bring a different way of looking at something, which ultimately is needed to solve some of these really vexing problems that are left over. So, by the way, I'll give you one personal reason. When I was a young scientist back in the 1980s, I was working on something that was pretty new right now. It was looking at microbial profiles of the soil. And so we did this by plating out the soil and different types of media, and then you counted things, and then you had to identify them. It would take me just months and months and months to identify and try to characterize a particular sample of soil. Now you can do that in about 15 minutes through genetic analyses. So it makes me feel bad about my early part of my career that I spent months and months and months doing something that someone can do in 15 minutes now. But that is why the problems that we have left now are just so complicated, because those new advanced technologies really took out all of the easy problems, and everything that's left is hard. Secondly, you need to be working with educators and evaluators, impact evaluators, and translators, people who will take the information that you develop and get it out to two things. We'll take it out and get it to the people who need it. But first, you have to evaluate the work, and you have to be able to describe it's important. And that's critically important when it's a federally funded project, because you've got to be able to convince a congressperson that next funding cycle that what you are doing deserves to get more money. And congresspeople or legislators, wherever they are, they have so many needs for so much money. They could spend 10 times more than they do. So they've got to make very, very hard choices. And so we all tend to get irritated with politicians and the politics of science. They've got really hard decisions to make because everyone has good ideas coming at them. So these are hard choices, but if you can't take your information and explain it to a politician, which they're not all the brightest people in the world, if you can't explain it to them in about 10 minutes, the likelihood of that type of work, and not just your project, but collectively SCRI, for example, or a section within SCRI, that's going to have a lower probability of being funded if it's not being explained. And so I hope all of your projects, again, regardless of the country you're from, that you are developing information that will put it in a format where the average person is able to understand it in a very short period of time. It's not quite the elevator speech, which is generally about 60 seconds, but if you can't explain it in 10 minutes and get someone to say, that's a great thing you're doing, we need to give you more money to do that, then you need to really think about the process that you're involved in. So that's impact evaluation. How do you determine what the importance is of your research, and how do you explain it to others? And then you got to carry that message out to other people who will need it. And there, even the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health in this country, they have now added points to the review process where if you don't have that outreach component to it, you lose points. And because these proposals are so competitive, some of the NIFA awards were down at less than 10% being funded. If you lose 5 points because you did not have an outreach component to it, then that almost guarantees you're not going to get the funding. And one of the things we are so lucky in this country for is that we have the Extension Service. That's what they do. So when you're writing a proposal and you're trying to develop an outreach component to it, all you need to do is call your Extension counterpart, and they can help walk you through the process of getting that information out to the people who need it. In NIFA, I saw lots of really interesting things. People were developing coloring books for kindergarteners, and they were developing podcasts around the topic the science topic that they were working on. Some of them, I saw one where they were developing a teaching program for middle school science teachers. So they were going to bring in 20 science teachers every year and spend a week with them, teaching them about the science of whatever they were doing. But again, if you don't have that, you're probably dead in the water in trying to get things funded. And as I said, that's true for every funding agency right now around the world. They all are looking at the same thing. They all have to be able to justify the research to those that make these really hard funding decisions. So I started out by saying that research is underfunded globally. That's not necessarily true everywhere. China right now has been rapidly increasing their support of agricultural research in particular. In fact, we in the United States we are just about at parity with China right now in spending on agricultural research. So it's kind of a race in some ways. I'm glad China's spending more money on ag research, and that just causes us to have to say, well, we got to spend more money now too. So it lifts everyone's boat a little bit higher. Brazil is doing the same thing. They are spending more money on agricultural research. Ours in this country has not increased. It's barely been at the rate of inflation, and so we are starting to fall back. And that's why collectively, my main message to you is we need to be telling this message better than we are, but telling it to the people who, I hate this sounds awful, telling it to the people who matter, the ones who make the decisions on budgets. So those are the legislators, those are the staffers. A lot of us, how many of you have been to Washington, D.C. to lobby someone on behalf of a project? All right, that's not very good for the things that you work on. Well, thank you for doing that, but you need a whole lot more people going to Washington, D.C., and your state capital as well, talking about this, talking about the messages, talking about why, if you're successful, be able to feed more people on this planet, talk about what happens if people continue to go hungry, if we don't meet our goals of doubling food production in just less than 30 years now, the problems that happen. So I've been able to work and live to some extent overseas and have seen poverty through in firsthand. And I know many of you have worked around the world too. You know what poverty means. The personal devastation of hunger and stunting, the inability to become a productive member of society as a result, when you are going to bed hungry because you don't have enough protein or micronutrients or vitamins. You know that those countries then, that's where terrorism starts. When people are hungry, you have nothing to lose. And so, we all, can say, well, so what? It doesn't matter to me. It does matter to all of us, if nothing more than a lot of the world's problems come from when people are hungry and don't have enough food to eat. And when we can all do something about it. What we do for a living, what all of you do for a living, is produce more food. And so if you're successful, this world is going to have a lot fewer problems, not just full bellies and not just healthier people, but all of the other associated problems that come from hunger around the world. So These are things that we have to do. I personally feel it's a bit of a obligation when, a scientist and you can do work that will help people around the world, you need to do it. But also, as we produce more food, and whether it's a producer of vegetable here in Florida or your country, we're also not giving away this food, by the way. We're creating businesses and helping the economy. And so it's both, both an important moral obligation to help people who need help, but also it's a business for all of us. And so we're very fortunate that we can, do good work that matters and make a decent living from it as well. I spend a lot of time looking at global forecasts. There are parts of the world right now that we're very worried about being able to produce enough food to meet the expansion of the population in some of those countries. You all know where these places are. If we don't grow more food there, and if we don't grow more food here in Florida or your country and create this dynamic network of moving food, we're a global network now of food production, by the way. If we don't get enough food moving around the world in a more important way than we are today, we got some serious problems. So you're the solution here to some very important problems that our planet has. And then lastly, just let me touch upon climate change. It's going to get a whole lot worse as a result of climate change. There are parts of the world right now that are being significantly impacted in their ability to produce food. Places in, I used to do a lot of work in Bangladesh, for example. There are large areas in Bangladesh that does not produce any food right now because of the saltwater intrusion and the fact that the coastal areas have just been devastated through storm after storm. These storms seem to get a little higher every year. We need these places to find ways to adapt to climate change. I think there are a lot of good things that can be done. We're resilient as scientists. So while the climate is going to continue to change, I think most of us believe that there's not a whole lot maybe we can slow it down a little bit, but it's just going to march on and on and on. But there are things that we can do that will ameliorate a lot of these changes that are coming about as climate change happens. So while it is going to happen, we have to be evolving and adapting and making sure that we are developing new crop varieties, new ways of growing things, new ways of managing water, new ways of getting water, new ways of providing nutrition to plants that will allow this planet and our industries to adapt to these changes. Here in Florida, but also in a lot of other countries now, in fact, other countries are ahead of the United States. One of the great advantages is that we're now looking at ways to reward farmers for climate mitigation. I mean, you hear a lot about things like carbon sequestration, where plants, trees, even algae in the oceans and lakes take up carbon out of the atmosphere. It can lock it up in a semi-permanent way, certainly for the next couple hundred years. And then farmers can be paid for that. We call, in Florida and the rest of the country, we call these ecosystem services. USDA is looking at the number of ways right now of rewarding farmers for that. Australia, a couple places in Europe are already doing that. We're now beta testing that here in this country. And so we also think that in the next couple of years, we're going to see our farmers who are growing cucumbers and watermelons, but they're also being paid for sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it up into soil. So what does that mean for your industry? Maybe root systems that are more dense and can lock up more carbon in the soil than in the above ground portions of the plant. Maybe that are more photosynthetically active and can fix more carbon out of the atmosphere. There are all kinds of things that you will think about that can help in that. And so it's one of those areas that is going to be growing, and you can expect to see out of the USDA, by the way, some new funding initiatives specifically for things like that. So with that, okay, I'm right in time. I'm just going to stop there, and if you got any questions for me, I can take them, or we can move into the cocktail hour. Yes, sir. Yes, I'll repeat the question. It was that we don't have enough people in agriculture. I think that's kind of the summary, particularly in the academic science side of what we do. So there was a Purdue study a couple of years ago. They're just about due to put out a revision of this or update, showing that for academia, which would include 2-year schools, by the way, too, but also 4-year schools all the way up to PhD, we're only training 60% of the needed college-educated workforce for agriculture. The other 40% just have to come from other industries. So you pick up someone from the automotive industry and move them into a fruit and vegetable industry. So we're not doing a very good job of explaining our message. Everyone in here talks about this on a regular basis. We all say we don't tell our story well enough. I've been saying that for 40 years right now. Some places have lost more than others. It goes back to what I said earlier. You all have an obligation to tell your message about the good work that you do and why it matters. I have an obligation to do that. Industry has an obligation to do that. So yes, we've all been trying to do that, but obviously it hasn't worked because I don't know of, when I worked at the University of Georgia, I don't know, we had about 3 students in poultry science. That's the biggest industry in the state of Georgia. Yet I never met a 17-year-old once that said, gee, I want to go to the University of Georgia and study how to grow chickens. No one ever woke up in the morning and thought that. Yet there were thousands of jobs that were having to be recruited from other industries. Some of them were very good paying jobs. We will always be burdened by the fact that agriculture there are very low paid laborers in the field, and there are CEOs that are making millions of dollars, yet most of what the public sees are the people in the field making essentially minimum wage, who are doing very, very hard work. And that, by the way, that's one of the reasons why we're getting into artificial intelligence in Florida, is that we don't think people should be doing those jobs. It's just such hard work. I don't even think animals should be doing that type of work. It's really, we need robots picking and harvesting and planting. But we need our communicators working with us. We need to do a better job of telling our story, and we're all working on it. None of us have done a good enough job on it. We're paying a price for that happening right now. I think there's a lot of societal prejudice against our industry. I know if I go and, for instance, if I go to a school that's primarily African American in Florida, and I talk about all the good jobs in agriculture, I'll talk to the young people and I'll say, yeah, I love what you're telling me. It's a great job. We feed the world. You can feel good about what you're doing. But I can't go home and tell my grandfather that I'm going to work in agriculture because my family is working to get away from agriculture because of the very sad history there. So we have a lot of that, societal bias against what we do. But I think that just puts more of a burden on us to keep telling our story. I don't have, if I had a good answer for you, I would have given it already. I'm just rambling now. Any other questions?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for your, Edward Evans from University of Florida, Tropical Research and Education Center. And thanks for your comments and insights. To what extent, or maybe if you could just say a few words, is it that we have a food distribution problem? And also, to what extent can we do more? I mean, I've always been hearing about it's a 40%, 30% food loss, right, pre and post. Can we do more we're always quoting the figures of the amount of production that we have to increase to feed the world, but do we have a problem right there? Or if you could say a few words about that?
Sure. Well, in this country, we produce enough food to feed everyone in the United States. The conundrum is we still have, it's about 25% of our total population is malnourished. A much smaller portion is undernourished. But we still have a lot of people who are hungry in different ways. Now, we would include obesity, for example. Even within that, that's poor nutrition, not just direct hunger. But yes, we have distribution problems. We have horrible food waste problems in most of the countries that are represented in here. There are things we can do about food waste. Much of the waste actually happens before it. So we talk about food waste a lot, but the fact is much of that waste happens before it ever even gets to the grocery store, because we have such high standards for the food that we consume that if it has an apple with a blemish, it does not get used. So we need to change our thinking about this. Science is having a tremendous impact. I was at the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Trade Association Friday in Orlando. It's the second largest trade show in the world, by the way. And they had lots of new technologies there that have been developed for reducing food waste, particularly from the time it comes out of the ground to the time it ends up in your grocery bag going home in a car with you. And some of it's data management, traceability, but there's all kinds of other hard science technologies that have just been developed within the last couple of years that will help with some of that. So it's science, it's technology, it's information management, supply chain management, but it's also changing attitudes about what's edible and what's not edible, and being more open-minded about our food consumption. So I've seen some estimates from the federal government. They think that the U.S. federal government, they think it's possible to reduce food waste by up to 50% in the best case scenario. The other 50%, it's losses that are just too hard to try to fix. But that's not going to fix everything. We're still going to have cultural problems that cause young people especially to go hungry, and transportation problems and COVID problems, all of which has contributed to the malnutrition that we have and the occasional hunger in this country. But there are some things that have happened and will continue to happen.
We all see the grower trucks in the road, and there's a sticker that says, "No farmer, no food," right? But I think we should give those politicians that not supporting the agricultural research those stickers to put their own cars. That will hopefully help them to understand how important is the farming and the research. I would like to get attention of everybody that the labor, especially the agriculture labor. As you know, in most all of the world labor is becoming a problem, especially in California right now. The point that I'm trying to make, when you harvest your food and then or fruit or vegetables, they will look for shelf life in the store. But now the field holding ability of that fruit is becoming even more important, because the grower cannot find a labor to harvest that fruit in the field, and he has more time to find somebody crew come and his fruit or vegetables will hold longer. So the labor is becoming more and more problematic, and maybe one of the solutions is the robotic, but maybe the higher pay for the labor will be maybe more.
Well, let me mention the first point first. Most people in agriculture, by the way, this goes back to our not telling the message very well. Most of us are introverts. Maybe you're not, but I am. I bet 75% of the people in here are introverts. That's just not in our DNA to get out and brag about, all the good things that we do. We tend to, I want to be in the lab. I want to solve problems, and I don't necessarily need to be in the public domain. But part of the way that rounds then up into becoming a problem is very few people in agriculture go into politics. In Florida, agriculture is the second biggest industry in Florida. And we've got literally a handful, 5 people in our large legislature that have a farming background. They get it, they're our advocates, but the other couple hundred don't, and they've probably never been on a farm. Food comes from the back of the grocery store, all the things that we hear over and over again. And then going back to labor, I think labor is probably the dominant issue for at least the next 5 or 10 years. We're not going to have robots picking cucumbers in the next 5 years in any significant way. I think we're getting to that point, but we're still going to need labor. So we need better laws, regulations, guidelines for bringing labor into the fields. Better pay, obviously, is the most important thing. But then the teachers would say, well, we need better pay too. And most land-grant scientists would say, well, we need better pay too. So, you can see where our problems are, and low pay is obviously always one of them. But
as you said, agriculture work the hardest work, but it's getting the least pay.
Right. Yeah. I'm not willing to harvest cucumbers. Some of you, but how many of you do it for a living?
Hi. I'd like to switch topics a bit and come back to what you said about research funding and basic versus applied research. I've made a switch quite recently in my career, so a lot of things you said has real personal echo. There's currently in Europe a trend, a strong discussion about the way we evaluate researchers. If I'm correct, there's even a petition that is brought to European Union questioning the way we use the metrics, H-index, impact factor, etc. Do you see such a change in the US as well, and in the future maybe a more global change that will help researchers to do both and to be actually valued for both?
That's a great question, and I'm aware of a program in, I think it's Ireland, an extension program, where their budgets are dependent upon increasing production. So it's not about the economy or not what the government thinks or how good their lobbyists are. If production goes up, so does their funding. I don't know what happens if production goes down. It's probably not good. But yeah, I have seen that in a couple places in Europe now where there's this sense of trying to tie the end result of what you do to your work. I think that's probably a pretty good thing to do. Now, in agriculture, we have 100 years ago, people were predicting mass starvation at this time. We have always kept up with our ability to produce food. The population is growing. People over and over and over again have said, we can't keep up. People are going to be starving on this planet in a very significant way. And so while I always got to come back and acknowledge that we have hungry people. But it's not because production has not kept up. It's because of all kinds of other factors that cause people to be hungry. So I think, I would be very comfortable doing that because the pattern, the history of the last 100 years is that we have kept up with world population. I think for the next 100 years, we will also keep up with world population, or at least until that point where, where it starts to curve off and, population starts to decline. So I'd be happy with that. I think we could. So here's part of the issue. I know I'm rambling again, but for the United States, the National Institute of Health's budget has gone up about tenfold in the last 20 years because they came out at that time and they said, we're going to cure cancer and we're going to cure Alzheimer's and we're going to cure heart disease and HIV, AIDS. And everyone, whether it was a politician or every person said, we want those things fixed. We don't have that message, and it's harder to say in agriculture because we say we're going to cure hunger globally, but none of us in here know someone who is dying of starvation right now. So it's not that problem is just not front and center of us every day. So most people, when you say we're going to cure hunger, they say, so what? I'm not hungry. But when you talk to someone, okay, I'm going to get cancer, I'm going to get Alzheimer's or heart disease, or HIV, whatever it is. We're all going to get something, and we all want those diseases cured. None of us see that hunger is something that we're worried about for us or our family. So that's part of the message, telling that we all understand that how devastating hunger is around the world and how many people die as a result of that, and the problems that come from hunger. But most people in the United States and other places just don't see it.
Thank you. I'm from University of Illinois. My name is Mohammed Babadust. You talked about China, you talked about Brazil and the United States. And when we talk about hunger problem, really we're talking about the developing countries. You did not really touch what we can do in the developing countries. For example, I have seen devastation of the crops in Republic of Georgia, Tajikistan, Ghana, and so on. What are your comments for the future from our side to help to developing countries?
Well, every country is at a different stage in development right now. I've worked in countries in Africa that are basket cases where nothing works, where you can provide better agricultural technologies, but there's no road to get the fertilizer or the improved seed to the village. So a lot more work is needed than just developing a better seed or a better fertilizer. Many other countries have moved beyond that, where technologies now, where they're at the point where advanced technologies can make it into that country and can make a difference. Most of the countries in the world, by the way, are at that point. Even though what we'd call the kind of higher developing countries, they're to the point where these new technologies can make a significant difference. The cell phones have made a huge difference in areas that have cell phones, because now you have access to all kinds of information that you did not have available to you just a couple of years ago. So it depends on the country. It depends on the level of the ability to accept those new technologies. So when I worked in Africa a lot, I remember this well. There was one village where there was no fertilizer used for production. So yields were about 15% of what they should have been. And people were hungry. So there was large infant mortality in that village. 50% of the population in that town was stunted. So some very significant problems. So we brought in fertilizer. We showed smallholder farmers how to utilize fertilizer, how to value it. They could quadruple yields very easily. And that meant that they now had enough for their own immediate families, but also something to take into the village and sell. And so now they got a little bit of money. You can buy milk or an egg for your child, or education for a family member, or healthcare, vaccinations, things that had huge impact on the population. But what we found beyond that was there was now this realization that fertilizers made a difference. You could grow more food, you could sell stuff. That was the first step out of poverty. But then you couldn't get the fertilizer into the village because there was no road to it. Or if you did, then there was no marketing system. Or if you did, there was some corruption, so the fertilizer got stolen along the road. There were just so many problems that it was very hard for any single technology to have a market difference. And those are the places that I came back from just going, I don't know what to do. We'll keep trying, but there's more than one problem to fix. But many countries now have moved beyond that. By the way, the globe's ability to feed itself, while we keep talking about hunger all the time, it is markedly better than it was just 20 years ago. By percentage, there are many fewer people hungry on this planet than there were just 20 years ago. So we made great progress, and things are moving in the right direction. Every country right now is moving in the right direction, except for a very small handful of places where usually it's politics that is holding it back. So I feel optimistic about the future, but everyone's at a different level of what comes next.
Okay, thank you.